A couple of weeks ago, Kate had come down with a small cold. That was just a head cold, which of course he has come down with again and has luckily passed along to me. So I will be probably sniffling and coughing up here a little bit, but I ask that you bear with me. When when he had this cold, it had been several months since we had gone through the routine of blowing our nose. And he had gotten to the point where anytime we asked him to, the initial response was no, or whining, or running away. So, not exactly what we wanted from the scenario. And I had seen in those intervening months, a couple of times online actually, an odd strategy, or seemed odd to me, for trying to convince your kid that it was a fun thing to do to blow their nose. So, yeah. So I decided, you know what, I'll go for it. We'll give it a try. Worst thing that can happen is I'm going to look stupid, but that's okay. It's pretty simple in concept. Basically, you get a tissue, you hold it in front of your nose, and then covering your mouth, blow out of your nose, trying to flap the tissue up in the air. Okay, it's meant to like supposedly simulate, like an elephant trumpeting, something similar to that. And then after they get the initial idea, you introduce a game aspect to it, where you either pick, okay, we're going to compete and one of us is going to blow it up the highest, or maybe we're going for longevity. We'll try to keep it in the air, flapping for as long as possible, whichever one. Again, just to get them used to blowing out their nose and not their mouth, and therefore being able to clear their sinuses. And I can assure you it looks as stupid as it sounds. But hey, if it's fun and it gets the kid to start being okay with blowing his nose, I was all for it. Now, at this point, I need to tell you something specifically about me for the rest of the story to make sense. Unless I myself have been sick for several days in a row, I generally do not have tissues in my house. I'm cheap, and toilet paper is almost the same thing, so I use that instead. Now, the toilet paper that I get, I am picky about. I don't cheap out. I get the nice, thick, soft, fluffy stuff, right? It's great. I hate going places that just have horrible toilet paper. But that means I didn't have an actual tissue to use for this exercise. I instead had to use my good quality toilet paper. Well, there's a problem with that. Did not occur to me that there was such a substantial weight difference between your typical tissue and my nice, thick, heavy toilet paper. So now back to the story. I am sitting down in the bathroom with Cade. I grab a couple of pieces of tissue paper, or of toilet paper. I hold it to my nose, I start blowing, and nothing happens. So I'm like, okay, I must not have really gone for it enough, I'll do it again. So I hold it there, and I really, really blow into it, and it moves just a tiny little bit at the end. It's like, okay, this is not getting the image that we're supposed to get here of an elephant trumpeting. Cade's not going to be into this. I've got to make it work. So I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to cheat. I'm covering really my face anyway when I'm doing this. He can't see that my mouth is where the air is coming out. So I'm going to blow to make it really impressive for a second and get him into the whole game. So I do. It blows up. Yay. And then we continue. I try to have Cade do it. We're going to leave the story there. And it's a weird story to start a sermon with, I know. But we'll come back to it. It will make sense, I promise. Or if it doesn't, you can tell me that afterwards. As we've been going through the Exodus class especially, but also the daily Bible readings, there's been a theme that's been sticking out to me over the last several weeks of God is much greater than I can even imagine. And so today I want to talk about the issue of scale. When I look at anything, one of the first things, at least for me, is I try to size it up and compare it to other things that I'm familiar with. And so when I've been going through these daily Bible readings and then through the amazing miracles that God did in the Exodus, I see so many times where things happen that I can't really even fathom. I have no real standard of measurement to compare it to. And so I'm going to look at 3 examples this morning of amazing things that God did that I think, at least for me, help me to get a better grasp on truly the scale of difference between God and us, and myself here on earth. And the first one we're going to go through is the account of Jonah and the big fish. Okay, so I'm going to read the beginning of this account, which is the entirety of chapter 1 of Jonah. It's not as long as it sounds. But so if you want to follow along, turn to Jonah chapter 1, and we'll read the verses there, the whole chapter. Excuse me. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. I keep saying Joshua, I meant Jonah. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because their wickedness has confronted me. However, Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. He paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. Then the Lord hurled a violent wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose on the sea that the ship threatened to break apart. The sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his God. They threw the ship's cargo into the sea to lighten the load. Meanwhile, Jonah had gone down to the lowest part of the vessel and had stretched out and fallen into a deep sleep. The captain approached him and said, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up. Call to your God. Maybe this God will consider us and we won't perish." "Come on," the sailors said to each other. "Let's cast lots. Then we'll know who is to blame for this trouble we're in." So they cast lots, and the lot singled out Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us who is to blame for this trouble we're in. What is your business and where are you from? What is your country and what people are you from?" He answered them, "I'm a Hebrew. I worship Yahweh, the God of heavens, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, what is this you've done?" The men knew he was fleeing from the Lord's presence because he had told them. So they said to him, "What should we do to you to calm the sea that's against us?" For the sea was getting worse and worse. He answered them, "Pick me up, throw me into the sea, so it may quiet down for you. For I know that I'm to blame for this violent storm that is against you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they couldn't because the sea was raging against them more and more. So they called out to the Lord, "Please, Yahweh, don't let us perish because of this man's life, and don't charge us with innocent blood. For you, Yahweh, have done just as you pleased." Then they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. The men feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Now, the Lord had appointed a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Not an unfamiliar story, right? None of this that I just read was something you haven't heard or read and studied in your Bible classes, probably hundreds of times. But there are several things that stood out to me the most recent time that I went through it, and I'd like to point those out for you quickly. The first one here, and I apologize that that's so small. The first one here is taken from verse 4, where it says, "Then the Lord, Yahweh, hurled a violent wind on the sea." So I said one of my observations here is trying to come to some kind of a true grasp of the power, the scale that God is compared to me. And if we look back through history or current events, there are lots of times where large storms arise and destroy ships or possibly entire fleets. One of the big ones that treasure hunters still look for would be the Spanish Armada that was destroyed by a storm. Sailors of old often spoke of the sea with great fear and reverence because of these things. Most storms, I believe, are the result of natural phenomena, however, as opposed to this specific instance where we're told God hurled the violent wind that caused this storm. And that level of power and control over nature is impressive, but counter to my goal here isn't something I can really understand. I don't know, maybe you can, but that's something so out of my realm of ability or things I've seen, controlling the wind and therefore making a terrible calamitous storm is beyond what I can really understand. So let's go to the next one. In verse 5, it said, "The sailors were afraid and each cried out to his God." Obviously, there were the other little g gods of the ancient Near East that were called to by these various men of different faiths, trying to beg them for salvation from this storm. And of course it did nothing, because those gods are nothing. And so we see instead they call for Jonah to call to his God, and apparently he was asleep at the time, which seems wild to me. In verse 7, it said, "Come on," the sailors said to each other, "let's cast lots. Then we'll know who is to blame for this trouble we're in." So they cast lots, and the lot singled out Jonah. I don't know how into watching like movies about casinos and blackjack and all that kind of stuff you're into. I don't gamble, but the movies about the math behind it and all that kind of stuff have always been fascinating to me. If I'm understanding this casting lots, it was some random chance that they were doing with the goal of one of the gods, little g, stepping in and manipulating it so that it gave them a real answer. Now, of course, that didn't happen, just as the little gods didn't answer the prayers to stop the wind. But manipulating chance, luck here, it appears Yahweh, the one true God, did. And as I said, looking at the math and the probabilities of casinos and blackjack and whatever else is fascinating to me, and you can manipulate it. There's a whole concept of like counting cards that supposedly get you thrown out if you're caught. There's lots of strategies to these games of chance, but I've never in all of those documentaries or movies seen anyone claim that they could actually control what number was going to come up on the dice. But God did. Just as he started the storm in verse 14 and 15, it was as simple for him to stop it. And then lastly, from this example, we have what we typically focus on in these stories, especially in kids' classes, is the big fish event. He could control a, quote, huge fish precisely enough to have it do several things. One, swallow Jonah, but not eat him. And then somehow keep Jonah alive inside of this fish for 3 days and 3 nights. There's lots, again, of documentaries about ocean dives to the Titanic or the Seagate company that, you know, the small man sub like imploded on itself a couple of years ago, and lots of fascinating things there I watch as well. And, they always take a few things to do these huge scuba dives. Lots of preparation, lots of modern technology and safety features to back them all up. Because when they fail, you have the OceanGate incident where the people just disappeared and died. I want to point you now to a Guinness Book of World Record holder, Saddam Kalani, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, but is an Egyptian who currently holds the record for the longest deep dive in open salt water performed by a man. They get real specific in these records. At the time that he was underwater was from November 5th to November 11th of 2020, which was for 145 hours, 25 minutes, and 25 seconds that he was submerged underwater, which, if you do the math, is just a little bit over 6 days that he was just floating underwater by himself without coming back up. Yeah, I see some faces scrunching. Yeah, that does not sound fun to me. I don't know why you would pick this as a record to go after, but he did. And I mean, it is impressive. I remember as a kid trying to hold my breath underwater as long as I could, and I might get to like 30 seconds or something before I'd panic. So 6 days, well, he had oxygen, but still, 6 days underwater is a really long time. But he wasn't just himself underwater. He had meticulous planning for over 3 years in preparation. In that same time, he was training and practicing, and then he had the benefit of modern technology and the best of modern technology. And then lastly, a whole team of people supporting him to be able to pull this feat off, who were resupplying him with oxygen because he wasn't holding his breath that long, he would be dead. Impressive, but nothing compared to Jonah being kept alive with nothing but the insides of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. This is a part of the story I feel like I can relate to more because I've spent lots of times in oceans. I've, as I said, attempted to hold my breath for long periods of time, many points throughout my life. This is something I can wrap my mind more around as a display of the true power of God. That he either created 3 days worth of consistent oxygen for Jonah or sustained him in some other way, but something beyond, far beyond anything the natural world would just do. At least as far as my understanding goes, there's no fish that we're aware of that just produces a livable ecosystem within itself. So this is something I can wrap my mind around of what an amazing, ridiculous feat keeping Jonah alive for those 3 days and 3 nights would be. And then we go to Jonah chapter 2, verse 10, to see the next thing God does, which is, quote, "The Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land." I don't know if you've ever been to SeaWorld or any zoo where they do events with the dolphins or the whales or anything like that. I have never once seen them give them a fish to eat, to do whatever the trick was, and it then spit it back out onto shore afterwards and not eat it. And yet God had such control over this fish that he could command it, and it did just that. Let's look at the second example that I want to go over this morning of this event, the event that was read for us already, the day that the sun stood still in Joshua 10. I'm not going to reread this whole section, but I do want to reread verses 12 through 13, where it says, "On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the presence of Israel. Quote, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Adjanal." And the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on its enemies. Isn't this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed its setting almost a full day. I didn't do the math, but I've seen quite a few sunsets and sunrises in my life, and they always happen pretty predictably. And by that I mean exactly predictably. Not once have I seen the sky stop moving and the sun stay in its place at all, let alone for almost an entire day. So I had my research assistant, ChatGPT, look up what the world tries to do or scientists try to do with this account. So the first section, biblical accounts, just a summary of what happened. I want to focus on the second and third, the interpretations. So items 2 and 3 here under interpretations really stick out to me. They say some interpret the event as a literal miracle where God intervened to physically stop the rotation of the earth. And the third one says, still others question the historicity of the event, suggesting it might be symbolic or a mythical narrative. The concept of the sun standing still, which, as we know from scientific exploration and discovery, would be more the earth standing still so that the sun wasn't looking like it moved to us, but is no less fantastic, is so outside of the concept of science, what modern science understands, that they have to default to that third item here in the interpretations of that it had to be a symbolic or a mythical narrative. This couldn't have literally happened. And if we go to the scientific perspectives then, again, point 1 and 3, it says, from a scientific standpoint, stopping the Earth's rotation would have catastrophic consequences, causing widespread devastation and potentially flying objects into space. Therefore, the idea of the sun standing still in a literal sense contradicts current understanding of physics and astronomy. Widespread devastation and potentially flinging objects into space. I'm sure if I had asked Mark to give me a quick little summation of why that is, you would have given it to me, but I'm trying to keep this brief, so I didn't. The concept of gravity and the motion of the earth, that the word I can't think of, rotation, is so fundamental to how we understand that nature and the ecosystem we live in called Earth functions, that if it were to stop, the theories are basically that gravity and everything holding stuff into the Earth would quit, and things would just continue with their momentum and go flinging out of the atmosphere. Well, while the account here in Joshua does mention the Lord slaying more of Israel's enemies than Israel themselves slayed, it didn't say they went flying out into space. They were still on Earth. Somehow, the natural order of the world in gravity and entropy and motion all stayed the way that we are familiar with it, except we stopped moving for a day. That's quite ridiculous to think about. And I can understand why, if you have no understanding or faith in God, why you would default to this had to be mythical or illustrative, not a literal thing. And yet, it was. Now, this is one I do struggle to wrap my mind around still. I don't know if you remember the old Superman cartoons from like the 50s, but my dad and I were big comic book nerds, and so we watched them as a kid. And there's one where Superman spins the Earth backwards to basically wind time back up. And even as a little kid watching that, it was a neat tale, but it wasn't something that seemed like, oh wow, look, Superman's so awesome, he can do that. I watched it as a kid and was even thinking, yeah, this is made up. God had the power at Joshua's request to hold the earth steady for a day and continue life functioning as normally. That's so far beyond what I can really wrap my mind around. Let's look at the last of the three that was the reason I started down this whole path, was when we were a couple of weeks ago studying in Exodus chapter 15, the song after the Red Sea crossing that's describing the events that happened. The way that I have always studied this, I like Exodus 14 better. I'm not a poetry guy. I'm a very, give me the facts, give me point A, point B, point C, and that they do that. We go through point by point what happened with the crossing in chapter 14. And so I've never really spent much time on 15 myself in my personal study, because I'm like, okay, yeah, you said the flowery version, but I already know what happened. Let's move to chapter 16 and keep going. When we were going over it a couple of weeks ago, there were some points that really stood out to me for that reason that I hadn't noticed before. I'm going to read Exodus 15 verses 7 through 11, which is by no means all of the song, but the section that stood out to me. It says, "You overthrew your adversaries by your great majesty. You unleashed your burning wrath. It consumed them like stubble. The waters heaped up at the blast of your nostrils. The current stood firm like a dam. The watery depths congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire will be gratified at their expense. I will draw my sword, my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Lord, who is like you among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, revered with praises, performing wonders?" The waters heaped up at the blast of your nostrils. Hopefully my story about the tissue is starting to connect now. I was embarrassed and had to cheat to blow 2 squares of toilet paper out flapping with my nose, or not my nose, my mouth. And God is described here as blowing his nostrils, and the sea parted and then stood there. Again, remember the tissue thing, one of the parts of the game is to keep it blowing as long as you can. It stood there open the entirety of the Israelite crossing, and then enough for the Egyptian armies to get in there with not enough time to escape. And then he quit blowing his nose and let the water come crashing down and destroy the armies of Egypt. The illustration that is used here in the poetic language just happened to hit right about the same time that this tissue blowing thing was with Cade. And so it was so starkly contrasted. My power of blowing air from my nose and God's power of blowing figurative air from his nose and holding up a sea. That I can, for this very reason, see the comparison more directly. Of look at the true power that God has compared to me. That then he took and blew the water back over and they were destroyed. These 3 examples of God's power are just a few of any that I could have pulled out, and quite possibly not the best that could have been pulled out. In fact, I skipped what I think is one of maybe the penultimate display of his power, being the story of creation, But I skipped it because it, again, is so much more beyond my realm of understanding than even the three examples I've gone over now, that I definitely don't have anything to compare it to. I've seen terrible storms. I've seen the trained whales at SeaWorld. I've seen many sunrises and many sunsets. I've been around the ocean my entire life. I've blown my nose, pathetically, comparatively, more times than any of these other things. So I can compare them a little bit to the power and the authority that God wields in similar circumstances. God's power is so far beyond not what I could hope to do, but what I could even imagine doing in these scenarios. And that's with, as we talked about with the Guinness Book of World Records holder, thousands of years of technological development and training and best practices building up to the 6 days underwater. And God just did them. No preparation. Doesn't seem like there was even effort because it's described so carelessly. He blew the wind, he trumpeted from his nose, right? Simple things. The sun stood still. That was it, no explanation. It just happened. I'll read verse 18 now from Exodus 15, right after the section that I read a moment ago. Verse 18 says, "The Lord will reign forever and ever." And if I was in the scenario where I had just seen the events firsthand of the crossing of the Red Sea, I think that would be my conclusion too. And so it should be now, as we have not only that example, but many more. That if there's a being that has this level of power and control and authority, then he's going to reign forever and ever. And there's nothing I or anyone else or any spirit could hope to do about it. Now, the end of my lesson here, my thunder was stolen a little bit on Wednesday. I think Mike and I were on the same page mentally. That a being this powerful, the concept that he knows me in the level he's described of knowing me, and not just he knows, but he cares, is mind-blowing. When we look at Luke 12, verses 6 through 7, it says, "Aren't 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten in God's sight. Indeed, the hairs on your head are all counted. Don't be afraid, you're worth more than many sparrows." As Mike said on Wednesday, how comforting is that? That he knows the number of hairs on my head. I don't have a clue how many hairs are on my head. That seems like such a pointless piece of information for me to try to figure out, and yet something that superfluous, God knows it too. Now let's read the rest of Luke chapter 12, or back up and read more context around it rather. I'm going to be reading from 12 verses 1 through 10 this time. "In these circumstances, a crowd of many thousands came together so that they were trampling on one another. He began to say to his disciples first, quote, 'Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing covered up that won't be uncovered, nothing hidden that won't be made known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in an ear in private rooms will be proclaimed on the housetops. And I say to you, my friends, don't fear those who kill the body, and after that can do nothing more. But I will show you the one to fear. Fear him who has authority to throw people into hell after death. Yes, I say to you, this is the one to fear. Aren't 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, yet not one of them is forgotten in God's sight? Indeed, the hairs on your heads are all counted. Don't be afraid. you're worth more than many sparrows. And I say to you, anyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. But whoever denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. Anyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but the one who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. When we single out just verses 6 and 7, it is quite comforting. But there's really 2 points that Jesus is trying to make in this section. One of them being, you need to know who to fear. Don't fear the Pharisees who can kill your body. Fear God, who is so beyond that once you're dead, he can throw you in hell eternally. Something far greater and beyond what we can truly picture as mortals. And then, in verse 6 and 7, if you're with me, don't be worried, because God knows. He even knows the hairs on your head. He cares about sparrows that are worth so much less than you or I as human beings to him. And at the end, I say to you, anyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge him before the angels of God. But whoever denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. It is a terrible thing to be thrown in the hands of the living God. He has such power beyond ourselves that if you're not with him, it's not going to be good for you. I didn't take the time, because I'm running long, to go through all the examples of what hell is described to be for us, but imagine the most painful thing you can think of consistently and eternally. That's basically it. That's how it's been described to us. And Jesus' point here is, if you side with me, I'm going to proclaim your name before God, and therefore you too will be saved. But if you're not, I'm going to deny you. I'm going to say, I knew you not. Leave my sight. That's what I take away from studying and trying to look at the level of God's power, his majesty, his greatness, how much bigger he is than me or us could possibly ever reach, and definitely beyond even what we can imagine in our mortal existence. And if you're not with God, you're against him. There's only 2 sides here. There's no middle where you get to roll the dice and maybe you're in. You're either for him or against him. And so this morning, I asked that all of us examine ourselves and truly answer that question. Am I for him or am I against him? If we're for him, we're going to listen to what he tells us to do. If we're not, we won't. So if you have a need this morning of being baptized, as has been shown is the way to be a part of Jesus' people, to repent and to become one of his children, to realign your life with Jesus' life and the example that he set for us, we would love to have you do that at this time. If you already have, but you've allowed the fear of what the world can do to you physically, or maybe even when I look at my own past, so much worse than that, I feared what the world could say about me or think about me. Not that they were going to actually hurt me, but just the social stigma I would have. Well, it's easier to just be quiet. If you, like me, have been in that situation or are in that situation now, it's time to stop. It's time to acknowledge God as the only true power and to come back to him and boldly proclaim him amongst everywhere we are. If you had either need this morning, come forward as we stand and as we sing.